Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Don sitting in the host chair today. I appreciate you giving us some of your time and joining us for today's episode. Today's episode, we're going to focus on a different path of events that could have happened in late April of 1836. And as you can tell, we're releasing this episode in April, so it's relevant to the calendar in terms of the timing. And it's relevant to me because of where I grew up and where I am situated geographically. That happens to be in the state of Texas, and happens to be not far from the battleground or the battlefield where Texas won her independence from Mexico at the Battle of San Jacinto, or I guess more properly pronounced San Jacinto. We don't pronounce it that way. That probably says a lot about who we are as Texans, in that we don't give it the proper Spanish pronunciation. But the battle, fought on April 21st of 1836, was about 900 Texians, as they were called, led by General Sam Houston, who would later become the first president of the independent Republic of Texas, defeating an army of roughly twice the size, probably around 1,500 men, led by and commanded by the president and general from Mexico, Santa Anna. Military historians will talk about the particulars of the battle, and the battle is interesting in the sense that there's a lot of things that could have gone differently. The Texian forces were outnumbered numerically 2-1. You might argue that the Mexican forces were not as experienced. And many military historians will tell you that there's no reason the Texians should have won the battle if the Mexican army had been led by a competent commander who had made competent decisions. The timing of the battle, a number of factors there could have suggested there would have been a different outcome for the battle itself. However, for our purposes of looking at today's fork in history, our fork in time here is not going to be as if the Mexican army had defeated Sam Houston at the Battle of San Jacinto on April 21st, but what would have happened in the few days that were after that could have meant that April 21 would have represented a Texian victory during the revolution against Mexico, but would not have ended that revolution. It would not have been the recognition point of Texas winning her independence. So today we're going to look at an alternate timeline that has a different set of events after April 21 of 1836, and how that might have played out for both the state of Texas, but also for how Mexican politics and how basically relations between Mexico, Texas, and the United States may have played out over the next couple of decades. In the show notes, I will include a couple of links to sites online, including the Wikipedia article on the Battle of San Jacinto, so that those who are not familiar either with the Texas Revolution, sort of the events that led up to that, or the battle itself, can get the background there, so we don't have to spend a lot of time on the podcast today. But basically, as I mentioned, the Battle of San Jacinto was something of an upset, with a much smaller, less equipped, less trained Texian army defeating the Mexican army and ultimately capturing the following day the Mexican president and general who was leading the Mexican army, Santa Anna. Santa Anna's capture led to an agreement and a treaty ultimately being signed by him, which recognized Texas independence, and a series of events after that ultimately led to, of course, Texas becoming an independent republic before being annexed by the United States in 1845. I would reference you to a number of other podcast episodes that we've had that actually relate to the general situation around and alternate history concepts around the acquisition of Texas by the United States. And one of my positions that I would take is that ultimately Texas probably would have become part of the United States some way, some fashion, if it had not happened the way that it did in the original real timeline of history, simply because American President Andrew Jackson and many others were very anxious to have Texas become part of the United States, or as the United States was making its manifest destiny push westward that dominated most of the 19th century, particularly the early part of the 19th century. So I'm going to argue that the ultimate fate of Texas is probably that it would have become part of the United States. But I think the way that it came to be is an interesting thing to consider here and an interesting fork in time. And so that's what we're going to focus on today. And a lot of what we're going to talk about in this fork in time here actually focuses around one of the most interesting characters in history to me. He's somewhat enigmatic to me, and that's Santa Anna, who was the leader of Mexico almost too many times to count in various forms. Both during its revolutionary phase as it was gaining its independence, and then actually post the Texas Revolution, and actually up through and including the war fought, the Mexican-American War fought in the late 1840s. As we often do here on A Fork in Time, though, we often have to look at the what did before we can better be informed about the what if. So just, again, not focusing as much on the Battle of San Jacinto itself, because in the fork that I want to explore today, I'm going to assume that those events played out the exact way that they did. That on April 21, the smaller Texian force defeated the Mexican force, and on April 22, they did capture and begin the process of negotiating with Santa Anna about what the fate of the newly independent Texas would be. That's not going to change. Certainly you could explore, and we may explore on future episodes, different timelines where that would not have happened, because it's certainly easy to imagine when you understand the details of that battle for it to have gone the other way. But what's important to note for the fork that we're going to consider today is what actually happened in the real timeline of history. And it's important to understand that it was not the entire collection of Mexican forces that were defeated at the Battle of San Jacinto. In fact, it did not even represent the majority of Mexican forces that were in Texas that were looking to put down the rebellion and the independence that had been declared by Texas just a few short weeks before. And so as we begin to look down the fork of history, we're going to look at a couple of other key figures that will play into our fork and how things might have turned out differently, and that begins very quickly after the Battle of San Jacinto. So again, the Battle of San Jacinto occurs on April the 21st. Santa Anna is captured, and the process of negotiating what's going to happen next begins on April 22nd. But on April 24th, the remaining Mexican troops that are in Texas actually gather approximately about 40 to 50 miles away from the site of the Battle of San Jacinto. So a couple of days march from where the Battle of San Jacinto has happened, where Mexican forces have been defeated. Those forces are eventually come under the command of two remaining Mexican generals. Those generals are General Vicente Filasola, who was actually the ranking general, and the other one was Jose de Urrea. So Filasola and Urrea were the two remaining Mexican commanders in Texas. The other Mexican commander that is well known from the Texas Revolutionary Campaign would have been General Cos. General Cos had arrived with his troops at San Jacinto the morning of the battle. And so, in fact, his troops had been part of those that were defeated as he combined his command underneath Santa Anna. And so the two remaining generals, Filasola and Urrea, actually meet in what is present-day Fort Bend County, which is southwest of Houston. If you're looking on a map today, you know that the battlefield for San Jacinto lies east of modern-day Houston, and Fort Bend County is probably roughly 30 to 40 miles away, where they had gathered at one of the key roads that connected that part of Texas in the 1830s back towards Mexico. The combined forces there are approximately about 4,000 troops that are under the command of the two generals, and so they are certainly far more substantial than what remained of Houston's troops that were now at San Jacinto holding their Mexican captives and Santa Anna captive as they were in the process of negotiating the treaty with him for independence. And so a council of war was actually convened on April the 24th or April the 25th, depending on which version of history you believe, one day after the news of Santa Anna's defeat had reached these two generals. So they have a force of about 4,000 men. They convene a council of war, and the question is whether to go and pursue the Texian army, basically to reverse the defeat at San Jacinto, or whether they would withdraw back to Mexico. The two remaining Mexican commanders are not in agreement about what to do next. The senior commander, Filasola, favors withdrawing to Mexico. This had actually been an unusual circumstance as they had marched north into Texas in the period over the winter of 1835-1836. That winter had been cold, it had been wet, and so they had had a number of difficulties with simply exposing their forces to the adverse weather conditions, which were not what they had expected. They had also moved so far north and gone beyond where they normally had provided supply lines. This is one of the well-documented things from military historians about the campaign in general, is they had poorly trained, ill experienced troops in hostile weather conditions, with a lack of supplies and dealing with muddy roads as a result of the rain. Moving equipment, moving cannon, moving other things around became difficult. It was a challenging physical environment during that particular time, and it also, of course, had been a challenging environment for the fighting against an army that wasn't really as organized in the term of the Texian army, more of guerrilla-style tactics and small force clashes. And so when the two military commanders meet at what's called the blockhouse, basically a fort um, along the Brazos River. In fact, that county today is known as Fort Bend County because of the fort that was on the bend on the Brazos River, being the settlement that was there. When they convene, they are not in agreement on what should happen next. Again, the senior Filosola is recommending that they retreat back to Mexico and then regroup and decide what would happen next. But Urrea, who was the junior of the two commanders and who had been successful with victories at three separate battles during the Revolution, was very much keen to taking the army that they had and immediately going and pursuing the Texian army and reversing the decision. And so we're going to use this as our particular fork in time. And what I'm going to assume here, I think, is not outside the realm of possibility, is that one of two things would have happened. Either that Urrea, the junior commander, would have been able to convince his senior in Filosola to actually take action or to at least consider it, or with the support of the men that were there, he may have deposed Filosola from command and taken command of the remaining 4,000 forces himself. In fact, if you look back at the history of the Texas Revolution and the way it was being portrayed back in the media and the way it was being portrayed back into Mexico, you will see that historians often suggest that part of the reason Santa Anna was so intent upon prosecuting the war the way that he did, which ultimately led to his defeat, most likely the result of overconfidence, was that he was playing back to not being concerned about the military outcome in Texas. In his mind, that was inevitable, but how it was being portrayed back in Mexico. What was happening, though, because of Urrea's successes at other battles, was he was being portrayed back in Mexico as a successful general. And so one of the things that actually appears to drive Santa Anna's behavior is concerned about one of the generals that, at least in theory, is under his command, although not directly connected to his forces in the Texas Revolution and their efforts to put it down, is that he's concerned about not being overshadowed or outshone by Urrea. So one possibility to consider, and the one that I'm really going to focus on here, is however it would have happened, either Urrea convinces Filosola or Urrea takes command from Filosola, is that those 4,000 troops that are assembled a few days after the Battle of San Jacinto do not choose to begin a long, arduous retreat back to Mexico, but instead choose to move forward and continue military action against the infant Republic of Texas and its troops who have just been successful at the Battle of San Jacinto and who actually hold President and General Santa Anna captive, but are not in a position necessarily to stave off a large attack by an organized group of forces that in this case would be about 4 times their size and numerical superiority. Again, balancing against the real timeline, what happened after that meeting in Fort Bend County was that after they withdrew south, eventually Filosola would be stripped of his command of troops, and Urrea would actually be elevated back to being in charge of the troops that eventually were intended to launch an invasion back into the newly independent Texas to reclaim the territory. So I'm going to follow, again, an alternate path here where Urrea assumes command of the forces that had gathered there a few days after the Battle of San Jacinto. Again, however that would have happened, I'll assume in my scenario that he has deposed Filosola, and he prosecutes the war against the Texian troops and begins to march eastward from his position in Fort Bend County towards the location of where the combined Texian forces now are they're at the site of the Battle of San Jacinto. Now, in the real timeline of history, most historians agree that part of what General Houston was doing, leading the Texian forces moving east, was obviously trying to evade the pursuit of Santa Anna and other Mexican forces after the fall of the Alamo and San Antonio. But he was also moving closer and closer and closer to the United States border, where modern day Texas and Louisiana meet the Sabine River, with hopes of getting the United States to intervene on behalf of Texas. We've talked about this in a number of episodes. We'll continue to talk about it, I'm sure, in others, just how likely it was the United States would have asserted any provocation to be able to cross the border and bring troops in support of the Anglos, while they had sworn to be Mexican citizens when they settled in Texas, who were now fighting for their independence against what was viewed as being a totalitarian Mexican regime. So, keeping that aside, focusing on the alternate timeline where Urrea now comes for the Texian army and begins to march on them, probably would have been a very short period of time before General Houston would have become aware of that march, and so some decisions would have to be made. One possibility would be trying to utilize the fact that they have leverage in the form of the president and General Santa Anna in their custody, to try to negotiate with Urrea a different type of negotiation for a treaty that would have led to the end of hostilities. Whether that would have recognized Texas independence, that's tough to know, but that's one of the possibilities. It might not have resulted in military action, but the very fact that Urrea was now marching towards them with superior troops in terms of number and experience, and having had success during the revolution, that there might have been a different set of negotiations that would have ultimately set up involving Santa Anna, but not involving Santa Anna as the one who's getting to make the call, involving Urrea as the commander of the Mexican forces, who is in a position of much greater strength than Santa Anna was in terms of negotiating with the Texans. So one possibility might have been negotiating some form of truce, might have been some recognition of the status of Texas still as part of Mexico, but with its rights reasserted. Some of those rights have been suspended under previous governments in Santa Ana in terms of abolishing their legislatures. That's one of the things that led to the revolution. The stated cause of the Texas Revolution was to restore, at least initially, during its initial calling of its independence convention, was around reinstating the Constitution of 1824 for Mexico. So one possibility is there might have been able to be a negotiated settlement with Mexican and Texas forces. Again, played out slightly differently, with Urrea applying pressure on the Texans and being in a different position in terms of what might have been agreed. Certainly could have seen Santa Anna attempting to give orders to Urrea, ordering to stand down or surrender the troops, or maybe trying to find some way to free himself and become the head of those troops and then prosecute the war. So one possibility, again, is the possibility there could have been some form of negotiated truce or surrender, or even a recognition, even a treaty, but it would have done it under different terms under the command of Urrea. I actually find that unlikely. If they would have made the decision to march against the Texian troops, I think it's very likely they would have continued that as a military action, not to produce a diplomatic settlement. And so that would have left General Houston with two choices: to muster forces and fight at a place of his choosing, probably not San Jacinto, against the larger Mexican force, or to continue the same tactic that he would have done previously, which is to continue the quote-unquote runaway scrape and continue eastward, now advancing ahead not of Santa Anna's troops, but ahead of Urrea's troops. Under that scenario, given the distance that existed between the combined Mexican forces, about 40 miles away when they begin their march, assuming that the Texian forces become aware very quickly of what's happening there, I think it's far more likely that pursuit eastward and the organized intentional retreat eastward would have led very likely to Texian forces getting close to or very near the border with the United States. Certainly to the point where it's much more likely that there would have been U.S. intervention at that time. As we've talked about in other episodes, if the United States enters that with its army, which was larger, better trained, better equipped, I think the most likely outcome is that they would have defeated the Mexican forces that were in Texas if there had actually been a clash, or they certainly would have forced the Mexican forces to stop pursuing Sam Houston, perhaps we get into a stalemate situation that would have lasted a period of months, perhaps even years. Or we may have seen the situation if once the United States Army committed itself to crossing the border and coming into Texas, that they would have prosecuted that war in very much the same way that we eventually see the Mexican-American War a little over a decade later. And so you would have seen a U.S. quote-unquote invasion, defense action is how it would have been termed, coming to the aid of the newly declared independent Republic of Texas, but it would have led to U.S. intervention and involvement directly during the Revolution. And I think there are two or three things that are key things to point out that would have been different under that scenario. If the United States had become directly involved, there may have been a period of time when Texas would have stood alone as its own independent republic, but I think it's reasonable to assume that would have been a much shorter period of time than what it actually did. Instead of the period from 1836 to 1845, I think it's very likely that Texas would have been an independent republic only for a few years, would have needed the United States military presence to secure that position, just as it had been secured with their aid during this revised timeline revolution. And as a result of the U.S. Forces being present, you may have seen Texas asking for annexation or coming to a treaty with the United States to have it absorbed into the United States much earlier than 1845. Another possibility, I think this was mentioned by Brent Frost in his excellent participation in a two-part episode that we had called American Hannibal, which considered a different timeline that would have involved Aaron Burr taking command down in Mexico, is that if you look at the other events of the real timeline of history, Mexico could have very likely chosen to sell off the area that was known as Texas to the United States or to the Republic of Texas in a financial transaction. One of the things that's a constant struggle and allows Santa Anna to come to power and is something that the Mexican government is dealing with in the 15 to 20 year period prior to 1836 when the Texas Revolution takes place, is they're dealing with financial crisis. And so selling off land or territory to the United States or essentially selling it off to Texas, maybe funded by the United States, would have been an option that might have been considered by the Mexican government. And so under that scenario, again, Texas still becomes part of the United States. It just becomes part of the United States earlier. And I think the most likely scenario is we would have some flavor of the Mexican-American War happening in conjunction with the Texas Revolution. I think that's the most likely outcome that would have happened had there been U.S. intervention. And again, U.S. intervention flows off of the fork in time that we're talking about here, which is the fact that the revolution does not end on April 21st at the Battle of San Jacinto and the subsequent treaties that are agreed, and then also later sort of unratified or that become disputed by the Mexican government, but that the end of the Texas Revolution comes as a result of U.S. military intervention. And so having a different end to the Texas Revolution, I think, has a different result of the Texas Revolution, once again with Texas becoming part of the United States much earlier and in a different way. One other possible fork that I could see here, again with Urrea taking command of the Mexican troops marching against the Texan forces, you might have seen a scenario where almost a Mexican civil war could have been played out through the lens or through the prism of the Texas Revolution. So imagine a scenario where, as part of what's happening because of Urrea's forces now marching towards the Texan army, a deal is cut more quickly between President Burnett of the newly formed Texas Republic and who's interim president and General Houston with Santa Anna, where the agreement quickly becomes that he will be released, he will go back to Mexico City and advocate for some form of independence or a new situation where he becomes an advocate for them. And the result of that is that Urrea is now left with a dilemma, perhaps. And that dilemma might be whether to march on Texan troops or whether to take his newly formed force that he has, and maybe instead of marching east to pursue the Texians, he chooses to march south. And how this would play out actually does sort of mirror a future event that would happen in history, where, again, it's amazing the number of times that Santa Anna rises and falls in his political career. in Mexico. But at a future point, there actually is an instance where Urrea actually leads forces against Santa Anna in something of an internal revolution. He's going to march his forces against one of the governments, one of the coalitions that's actually led by Santa Anna. And so under this other alternative that I'm discussing here, the potential exists that Santa Anna is released to go back to Mexico to take a position of essentially nullifying the revolution, agreeing to the terms of retreat or surrender, or allowing Texas to gain its independence, some variant of the actually agreed Treaty of Alaska. And instead now, Urrea doesn't actually march against Texian forces, but instead he turns his army south. And the reason he's going south is he feels like he needs to depose Santa Anna in order to have things move forward as the way that they should. And so under this scenario, he takes troops south. So instead of a retreat, which is what actually happened under Filasola in the real timeline, he leads those troops south, and they cross the Nueces River, which is the boundary between the area known as Tejas and Coahuila, and he eventually marches and crosses the San Jacinto River. In my mind, the sort of historical image that I have here echoes back to Roman history, where Caesar takes his troops, takes his legions across the Rubicon River, the crossing of the Rubicon, the phrase that we know there, where he took his forces that were intended to be an army to deal with external foes, to go deal with an internal situation. Let's imagine that the Nueces River, the San Jacinto River, represents, if you will, the Mexican Rubicon. And so now Santa Anna, who by ship has quickly, from one of the ports nearer to the coast, has fled from the Battle of San Jacinto with the agreement that he's reached with the Texans to go back to Mexico to present that and to enforce that. And Urrea now marches south, intent upon undoing that, with the intent to come back later and reconquer Texas. And sort of that scenario, I have Urrea sort of as a Mexican Caesar. And again, he's crossing the Mexican Rubicon, either the Nueces River as he's leaving from the area that's known as Tejas or Texas, or the San Jacinto River as he marches further south. So in that scenario, again, what plays out is another variant of political turmoil and essentially a civil war inside of Mexico that's excited or instigated by the Texas Revolution. So I presume there, in summary, that is a successful outcome for the Texians in the revolution, in the sense that they may have considered themselves independent, at least for a period of time, but that independence would have been shakier. So once again, I think we continually find ourselves perhaps with an earlier involvement by the United States, either in the role of declaring itself an ally of the Republic of Texas, making it very clear to Mexico, whether that's under Santa Anna, whether that's under Urrea, whoever it might be under, that if you attempt to retake Texas, that will mean war with the United States. So that scenario exists, or the possibility, once again, of Texas very quickly suing for annexation or asking for annexation by the United States as formally as a territory to make that protectorate status even more firm. It's interesting to me, Texas is known as the Lone Star State because it had that period of time when it was independent for 9 years, from 1836 to 1845. But that independence, while being true, in some ways was a technical independence only. I think if you had asked most folks in 1836, particularly the Anglos that were in Texas, the Americans that were in Texas, they sort of always knew that eventually they would probably be part of the United States or have such a close relationship with the United States, even if they weren't formally part of it, they would be connected to it. So under both of these scenarios, either the scenario where Urrea pursues military action, if that's our fork, or if he chooses instead, because of the response by Santa Anna and what was agreed there, to turn around and take action back into Mexico to try to right internally what he views as being wrong with the leadership under Santa Anna and having lost the revolution in Texas, then in both of those instances, I think they both of those paths, while they diverge for a little bit, tend to lead back to the same place, and that's the United States and Texas becoming connected, either very quickly because of U.S. direct involvement or a much sooner involvement to protect the status of Texas. And so it's interesting to me that the decision that's made there at that small fort about 40 miles away from the Battle of San Jacinto a few days later, where Mexican troops who had numerical superiority, a good reason to believe, if you look back, at least from a military standpoint, that they could have successfully prevailed, at least in the short term, to put down the revolution, having been successful, choosing not to and choosing to withdraw. That decision is probably more impactful on the real timeline of history than the actual Battle of San Jacinto itself, at least in my mind. Again, the Battle of San Jacinto, recognized as being the place where victory for Texas was, where Texas independence was won, victory for Texas was won, is only valid in the sense of what happened or did not happen afterwards. There were no further battles, there were no further conflicts in the Texas Revolution, and so it's over. And it's over with the last victory being on the Texian side, and with them having as a captive, as a prisoner, the president of their enemy, who happens to be the leading general, and being able to exercise that. So, again, what didn't happen after that is important because it reinforces the value of what did happen. This unexpected victory at San Jacinto is made valid by the fact that there wasn't a subsequent battle and there wasn't subsequent military action. It endorses that and makes that the end point of the Texas Revolution, when in fact, if you look back at the situation there, it did not necessarily need to be that. And it can be easily argued that if the game, so to speak, were allowed to continue, if that wasn't the end of the game could have had, at least in the short term, a very different outcome. Again, having said all of that, I'm a firm believer that the long-term outcome would not have been different. Eventually, the forces that had come into play, that had aligned in terms of the sweep of history, who was in Texas, the relative power positions of the United States and Mexico, all of that that's going on eventually, I think, does lead to the United States possessing the land that's known as Texas, but it would have come to be in a different way. So on that note, we'll end today's episode. I appreciate you joining us here on A Fork in Time. And once again, we are very aware of what's going on globally with the COVID-19 pandemic response, and our prayers and our thoughts are with our listeners all over the world. Again, we have placed a thing on our website at aforkintimepodcast.com for you to check in with us. We'd love to hear from you. If you've been affected, let us know how you have been, so we can. I'm a believer, and I'm unashamed to say that, so we can pray for you specifically, or just letting us know that you're okay. And we know that we have approximately 250 to 300 regular listeners worldwide to the podcast, and so I have no doubt that somebody has been affected, but we'd like to know how you are. We like to think of what we're building here, as we've said so many times, both Alexis and I, that we consider ourselves building a community here on A Fork in Time, and so we want to know how our community's doing, particularly during these difficult times. We're going to continue to produce the podcast as best we can and continue to get that out there, hoping that provides at least a few minutes of distraction and diversion from what's going on, but also recognizing that in the big scope of things, A Fork in Time is a very small thing compared to what's going on globally. In fact, the fork in time that I would like to make a reality, as I'm sure we all would, is to go back several months and not have this happen. I'm sure at some point in the future we may have a podcast episode talking about the impacts and how things could have been differently without it. Hope we do that from a position of having things being over and not as bad as some of the experts have said that they could be. Again, we encourage you to visit the website to do the COVID check-in. I also just encourage you to visit the website to learn more about the podcast and give us feedback. We do appreciate your feedback. We hope that it's positive, but we always know that it's constructive, and we've altered and done some things differently as a result of that feedback, so we encourage that as well. You can give suggestions for show topics. There's all kinds of things that you can do there on the website, in addition to having access to the entire back catalog of all of our shows for free there. So if you're a new listener to the podcast, and you want to go back and even just understand what some of those past episodes are in a little bit more detail that you're seeing there on your podcatcher feeds, there's some descriptions that go back there most of the way back. I think we go back to about episode 7 or 8 in terms of having just the items there that describe what the episodes are in a little bit more detail than a title. As always, we want to say thank you for your time and for your attention. Get the word out. Use social media to spread news about who the podcast is and what we do to those that you think might be interested. And certainly, if you are willing to and are able to, there's the opportunities that exist there on our website to be connected to our Patreon page, where you can provide financial support to the podcast if that's something that you are able to do and are inclined to do. We don't do this to make money, but it does help defer the cost to maintain the podcast. And so if you're able to do that and are willing to do that, we would ask you to at least consider that. One of the things that we're trying to get better at are some of the extras that we promise our Patreon supporters. Those are some of the bonus episodes and the other things that appear that are available only to our patrons. And actually some of the downtime associated with social distancing and working from home, which is my environment, and in Alexis's case, not working because she's been furloughed from her job, we're going to have the opportunity to pull that together a little bit more. I didn't mention this as we started the episode, but realizing here, this is going to be episode number 50 of the podcast. A nice round number, episode 50, and so I didn't want to let that go by without recognizing it. If you've been with us from the early days of the podcast, thank you. If you're a latecomer, thank you. We just hope that you enjoy what we do here, and we look forward to your participation in it. So as I sign off here now, saying God bless and good luck, and we look forward to having you join us next time. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more about the podcast at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Join us next time.